So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden, and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as it appears in organizations and communities, can benefit other humans and the planet we depend upon. So we're speaking to the people who are in the middle of doing that, people who think they know how to do it, and people who are doing kind of in-depth academic studies of what works and probably what doesn't work as well. And today I'm incredibly lucky to have Chenai Mukumba with me, all the way from Nairobi in Kenya. And Chenai is the executive director of the Tax Justice Network Africa. Make sure I get the words right. And I'll let Chenai explain what that is in just a second. But essentially, you're running that network, and you've had previous roles, I believe, Chennai, with the World Trade Organization and a history kind of working in this field for a while. But do you want to start off and just say a little bit about what, can I abbreviate it to the TGNA? It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah.
Tell us what that does.
So TGNA is a civil society organization that works as a research and advocacy institution. We are a network in the sense that we have our secretariat in Nairobi, but then have a membership base of about, I think we're close to 50 national level civil society organizations in 26 African countries. And what we do really is do the work promoting and advocating for resources to be mobilized domestically. So in a sense, we're of the view that if countries are able to harness their own potential, harness the potential of their own domestic resources, then we can start to chip away on the dependence of external sources of financing, right? So such as debt, as well as etc. So that's really what we think about a lot and spend a lot of time trying to convince governments to do work on.
Okay, and you're running the secretariat, you're the executive director. So you said, so you're bringing together all these people from different countries in Africa, which must have go on.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, yes. So I serve as the executive director of the secretariat that's based in Nairobi. I've held the position now for, interestingly enough, I would say just over a year. I was acting for the first, I'd say 9-10 months when the former executive director stepped down. So I've held the position of, I would say, both acting and now confirmed for close to 2 years.
Okay. And what I was going on to say was that, trying to manage all those different relationships across all those different people in different organizations in different countries even must be an immense job. And I'd love to talk to you about some of the practice of that. Just before we do that, I'll say something about what we mean by power and what we mean by healthy power, if that's okay. So as you probably know, there are detailed theories about power and how it operates and so forth. But to avoid that contentious argument, we're using a very simple definition of power, which is basically about getting goals met or getting needs met. And then when we say healthy power, we mean doing that in a way that actually increases other people's power as you do that, as opposed to toxic power, which kind of takes other people's power away. So given that kind of definition, I'd love to hear a little bit more. And specifically, we're more interested in practice. But could we go back a little bit earlier in your life? And I'd like to ask first, how did you and when did you first realize that power was important, that it matters?
It's a really interesting question because I think when I trace back my own life, there's a particular moment that I sort of go back to every time someone speaks to me about power, or rather the ability to influence, so to speak. And so I remember when I went into high school, it was a very new school, and I was still trying to figure out who's who and what works how. And so because of that, I was quite quiet, very timid, very reserved. And then interestingly, next to me, I had a girl who had, next to me sat a girl who had a completely different temperament. And I always found that really interesting because people tended to be drawn to her quite a bit. And often whenever she said something, you could see the way in which it influenced people's thinking, etc. And I remember at that moment sitting in that classroom when I was 14, thinking to myself, oh my gosh, there's something about the ability to influence that this girl next to me has that I don't have. But it's so important because however she wakes up and decides she wants to use that power is really what's going to influence the outcome of that classroom setup. So I would say if I was to trace back, that for me was really the moment when I realized the value and importance of power.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And you've been working on it ever since, by the sound of it, increasing your
I did.
influence.
Yeah, because interestingly enough, so she sat next to me. We were really good friends, and I mean, I look back at now, but to some degree, I think I started trying to see what parts of her do I like, that I would like to see in me, that I think are worth adopting and absorbing, and I think that began my journey, right,
Okay.
to see the extent I could start to grow a healthy sense of power.
Okay, lovely, good. Okay. Are there things you think more generally in society then? I mean, obviously, you're in a different country on a different continent, but I'm imagining there are some similarities and some differences, and I'd like to really understand those. But do you think there are things that we misunderstand about power, particularly maybe in the developed countries as opposed to the developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people think power, they think a very specific type of power, right? They think an aggressive power. They think a very domineering, dominant power. I think those is, I would say, are some of the initial thoughts that come to mind when you
Mm.
when you think. But I think the reason for this podcast, right, is because there's so many different types of power, right? And I think it's really important to expand the way we view that and recognize that, different types of power exist, and different types of power are necessary in different circumstances, right? So I would absolutely say that I think that for me is some of the misconceptions that exist around power.
That it's just that one type of power, and as you're saying, there are many other different types. And we're using these words, healthy power. What does healthy power mean to you then in your situation?
I mean, I think healthy power is an ability to influence positively, in a way that really sort of takes advantages of the different traits that you have, right? So
Hmm.
I think I mentioned earlier that we tend to think that power looks one way, right? And I think at times there is a need for that type of power, right? You don't really want to, for example, go to battle or go to war with somebody who, for example, may not have um, sort of a dominant sense or leadership sense, a type of power at that point. So I think for me, a healthy sense of power is recognizing what traits that you have,
Okay.
and using those most sort of meaningful way to influence those around you.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. Thank you. This is really helpful. And the Tax Justice Network Africa itself is trying to do something healthy. I guess that's right. You're trying to improve things to stop outward flows of money and balance things up and so forth. So could you start to talk a little bit about how you actually do that? And I'm particularly interested in, as you said, you're a secretariat trying to organize all these different people. What's actually involved in that in practice? How do you do your work, I guess?
Yeah. So I think we really see our role within this world, with this world of tax justice, as one of influencing,
Hmm.
and I think we recognize there's a number of different ways of influencing, in order um, to see how we can contribute towards, a thinking that we think is in the best interest of the continent, right? And so the way in which we do that, it tends to be specific to the different stakeholders that we're engaging with, right?
Mm.
So, for example, when we are, say, working with policy makers, right? I think in that situation, we've, for example, put together a report, right? And so we're engaging in conversation to try and convince them, right, of the benefits of a certain argument that we're trying to make. But what we've recognized is that when you're trying to influence, there tends to be sort of two different entry points, right? There's those who are what we like to say the suppliers of tax justice, right, which are the policymakers that we're working with. But then in the same vein, there's also those who demand tax justice. And so alongside that work that we do with policy officers, we also do a lot of engagement, particularly through our members, with the general public, right?
Hmm.
Essentially in them about what their rights are, right? What they essentially are entitled to, so that they have the power to demand, right? What is rightfully theirs. So in a sense, what we're trying to do in our work is essentially achieve tax justice by both influencing those who supply it, so to speak, as
Mm.
well as those who should be demanding it. Yeah.
Mm. That's a really nice distinction. So with the policy people you're trying to influence them, and when we talk more about that. But with the general public, it sounds like it's quite
Mm.
educational. You're kind of educating people about the power that they might have. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And for example, I will probably talk about it a little bit later, but I mean, if you think about the sort of the recent protest that happened in Kenya, right? There was an awareness of the general public about the power that they have, right, in
Mm,
holding their policymakers to account, right,
mm,
for
mm,
resources that really should be spent in their best interest. So that's an example of, you know,
mm,
some of the other sort of
mm.
power I think is important when we talk about these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. And coming back to the policy people, then again, I think I've seen a photograph of you at I think what was a WHO conference maybe recently, you know, and you're kind of presenting and kind of talking to these policy people and citing articles from the United Nations about how things should be done. I mean, and I kind of get that it's kind of policy work and you're influencing in that way. Could you say a little bit more about the actual practice of that? Because I know you make speeches and that's part of it, but presumably there are other bits to it as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So the speeches are important. I think the public facing work that we do is really important, especially from a sort of shifting narrative perspective. But one of the things that we've found to be equally important, and I think anybody who's in this space will tell you, is also the conversations that you're having behind closed doors, right?
Hmm.
So, for example, I was telling someone just the other day that as TGNA, we've been very heavily involved in the negotiations that are happening in New York around the establishment of a UN tax convention, right? So, an agreement, a global agreement on tax. And so you'll have seen that at those meetings, either myself or my colleague Evelyn, who leads this work, will make a number of interventions, you know, during the negotiations. But what we found actually at times to be much more influential is the conversations that happen in between, right? During the
Okay.
tea breaks with the different so that is a strategy. I think that's also quite important in this work.
That's great. Thank you. And when you have those kind of conversations over a cup of tea and things, then what kind of thing do you say? I mean, I don't mean you to betray any kind of secrets, but is it you know, do you talk about power, for example? Does that ever get discussed in these fora, or
Mm.
indeed with these people?
I mean, I wouldn't say that we've. Well, no, that's not correct. I was going to say we haven't explicitly spoken about power, but we have at times, right? Because in many of these
Mm,
conversations, particularly intergovernmental conversations, there are serious power dynamics, right? When you consider the
mm.
different countries that are at play. One of the things, I'm going to go a little bit into my text a little bit here. One of the things that we're actually trying to counter in trying to push for the UN to have a much more central role in global tax discussions is the unhealthy power that we've identified that currently exists in rulemaking at present,
Mm,
right? Where
mm.
right now conversations happen at the OECD where there tends to be a dominance of rich countries that are influencing conversations. Whereas at the UN, right, it's one country, one vote, right? And so
Okay.
there's a power element to that. So yes, power enters our conversations to that degree. But I think to your question, when we're meeting some of the delegates, essentially what we're trying to do is in a sense appeal to their power, right? Because they're now when they say something, because we've shifted the dynamics a little bit, where one country has one vote, you know, we sort of say to them, if you raise this as something that you think is important to be discussed at this platform, although you are one country, right, you have significant influencing power with regards to contributing to the outcome, right? And so this is what we say to them when we're trying to see if we can ask them to put a specific topic on the agenda.
Okay. And so then I'm getting a picture of the way you're working with the formal power dynamics. So as you said, one country, one vote, or whatever it is, but also presumably there's some kind of informal
Yep.
power
Yep.
operating. I mean, some of these people have more informal power than others, I'm guessing. Is that right?
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, of course, I won't go into the details, but
Mm,
even within, for example, country groupings, right? So at the UN, it's the Africa group that's been pushing, right, for this democratization and, you know, sort of centralization of tax conversations. But within the Africa group, there are certain states that definitely have much more power than the others, even though we collectively refer to them as the Africa group.
okay. So, and where does that come from, that power then? I'm curious to know. Is it history
Oh,
or?
Sometimes it's history, sometimes it's personality,
Ah,
right? Or
okay.
sometimes it's somebody who just has more knowledge on a certain topic and so can speak much more authoritatively. And so a lot of people, will follow what they say. So I guess the power comes from a number of different elements.
Yeah, and like your high school friends, personality plays into that, doesn't it? And sometimes people are just eloquent and sometimes they're less eloquent or whatever it is, or just other aspects of them. Okay, that's great. And could you talk a little bit? I'm also very interested to hear anything else you've got to say about the Secretariat, but I'm also really interested to know about kind of colleagues and your organization. So you've got quite a big organization, I think, haven't you? How does the power work at a more, because the reason I'm asking that is because, again, I'm imagining when you're in these important fora, there's certain ways of doing things and certain rules. And then when you're back in the office working with your colleagues, it's different again. What could you tell us about how it works back in the office?
Yeah, so we have a team, at least as the secretariat, of about 40 different individuals. So you
Hmm.
can imagine there's a whole host of different things
Yeah.
that are happening at any given moment. And you absolutely are right. I think there's different ways power dynamics come to play. But one of the things that I'm always trying to, I think, speak to the team about is that, we all play different functions in trying to achieve a certain objective, right? Because I think at some point, I noticed creep within the organization, and a type of hierarchy, right?
Uh-huh.
Whereby it's as though those that were much more outward facing, for example, had more power and more influence within the organization. But I took that back a little bit and I started to say, at the end of the day, if you don't have the really important work that's being played by the finance department, by the partnerships department, by the logistics department, right? You actually aren't able to play the function that you play when you go out there, right? So I really try to do away with that hierarchy and try to speak about the work that we did much more collectively, so
Mm,
that it,
mm.
it, it was, I think, in a sense, clear to everybody, right? That all of us play an equally important role in helping the institution achieve the objective that we try to achieve.
Yeah, that's really nice, isn't it? The sense that it's a collective working together. And as you say, whatever anybody does or how much time they work or whatever, it's contributing in some sense. Again, just going a little bit deeper, if it's okay then. So again, you mentioned that you kind of talk to people about that. So that, again, do you then talk to them about power and about hierarchy and say we have a hierarchy? Or is that, because some people, I think the last interviewee I was talking to was pointing out how often power is a taboo word almost in organizations. It's quite something we don't
Mm.
really talk about.
I mean, it's a good point because I don't know that I've explicitly used the term power. I think within the organization, but I definitely I think allude to it a lot, right?
Hmm.
In different conversations. So I think I talk about that a lot, particularly with the management team, right? I think when trying to see how we can set the tone for the entire institution,
Hmm.
and talk a lot about I guess in a sense hierarchies that at times we start to see evolving within the institution. So to say, you may want to watch that because there's dynamics that are being created there that may not be in the best interest of the organization. So I think in response to your question, we talk about power a lot, but I
Hmm.
don't know that we talk explicitly as often as we do when we talk about it. Yeah.
Hmm. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, there are many ways of referring to power without actually using the word power somehow or other. Like we can use hierarchy and all of those kind of things. And I think that's really valid. Do you think you were talking earlier about how you've worked to kind of change the amount of influence you have over the years? What have you changed then? What's changed for you? Is it attitudes that have changed, or have you become more skillful? What's changed for you over that time? If you don't mind
Personally,
saying. Yeah,
yeah,
personally, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I totally take the point that it's about, the
mm,
group working together and all of those kind of things. And so
yeah,
some of those as a manager and leader, I'm assuming are skills to do with, noticing the group dynamics and all those kind of things. But I'm just generally more interested in what you've had to kind of learn as
Yeah,
you've gone through your career.
yeah. So I think it's a couple of things. I think I've learned that I've learned very quickly that the people around you, your network, right, is a really, really important um, piece with regards to the influence you're able to exert, right, on an idea, on a person, etc. Right, and interestingly, I learned this, I would say, prior to joining TGNA, when I was leading an institution in Lusaka, and I just arrived in Lusaka, and what I was tasked to do was raise money for this local institution, right, and so I sort of got on with writing proposals and concept notes and sending them to everybody that I knew, but very little came back. And then all of a sudden, it's almost as though something clicked. I realized it's because nobody knows who I am, right? And so I started to attend all of these different meetings and made a point that even if I wasn't speaking on a panel, would raise my hand, ask a question and state who I was, right? And the more of that I did, the more familiar people became with me. And over time,
Mm.
realized that I now was able to, reach out to people that I hadn't been able to reach out before, right? And influence in two different ways. Number one, the resources I was trying to get for the institution, but also secondly, right, the type of ideas that I was trying to push forward. So definitely, I think your social circle, social capital, your networking is a really, really important element of that power. However, having said that, it's still important to be able to write the concept notes, etc. And the point I'm making here is that I've also realized that it's so important to make sure that you're also technically astute on the topic it is that you essentially want to influence or
Mm.
contribute to agenda setting for. So at a
Mm.
personal level, I'm a sucker for punishment. I'm back in school already because I'm trying I'm trying to increase my knowledge, right, on this technical work of tech. So I would say sort of the social element of the work is important, but so is sort of the very technical bits as well.
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you. That's a very nice answer. Um, could you say a little bit about any mistakes you've made in relation to power, perhaps, across your career, across your long career?
Um,
Or
yeah,
maybe the
yeah.
most
I can.
painful one, if we can think of it.
Um,
And
yeah. I
even
mean,
which domain, is it in the policy sphere or is it in the internal sphere in the organization?
I think at times I think I would say some of the most difficult or painful sort of situations have often tended to be within the organization that I'm in, right? So I think as I've been trying to understand and learn to navigate my own power, one of the things I've struggled with a little bit is when to be, as I mentioned right at the beginning, sort of domineering, dominant, and sort of very hard with my power, and when to be a little bit more gracious, a little bit more
Mm.
understanding, I think, my power. And at times I found that I used the gracious, understanding type of power when I really should have been, much more forthright, much more hard with the individual that I was working with. And when I found that when I didn't do that, it had implications not only on, of course, the work that was happening, but on the broader institution. There's a time, definitely, I look back in regret when I definitely should have put my foot down and been the much more dominant, didn't, and that affected the entire institution that I was working with, right?
Mm.
And so I think there's something about needing to know when to use a certain type of power at the right time, right? Because of the
Mm.
implications that, yeah.
Mm. No, great. Connecting to the kind of situation you're in and the context and all of that. And it's a very practical judgment, isn't it, to make it? Because it seems to vary all the time. There's no easy, you can't read it in a book which one to do. You have to kind of base it on what's actually happening. Could you, thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. Lovely, lovely stuff. The other kind of obvious thing, which we haven't really quite, well, we touched on a little bit, I suppose, with the policy thing, is the huge kind of imbalance between the developing countries and the developed countries in terms of power, which I see as a kind of broader context for everything you're trying to do. Could you just, most all the other people I think I've been speaking to have come from developed countries. So it'd be really interesting to hear a voice from a developing country, or from Africa, really, about how do you see that power imbalance, and first, how do you see it, and then maybe we'll go on and talk about how you deal with it, how you address it. I mean, we're talking about,
Yeah.
histories of
Yeah.
colonizing and all of those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I see it as two things. I see it as artificial. And I also see it as man-made, not inherent. I was trying to think of a better word to phrase that. And the reason I say that is because I was in a conversation, I think a few weeks ago, when we were sort of, I think we were talking about, what does Africa bring to the table, right? When you think about where we are from a GDP perspective, our poverty perspective, you know what I mean? Is there anything that we bring to the table? And I remember thinking to myself, oh gosh, that's a really scary thought, because we actually bring a lot to the table, right? Because when you think about the global dynamics, the countries that are rich are almost entirely dependent on a lot of things that are coming from the developing world, right?
Mm.
Whether you're talking about sort of natural resources, right? Or you're talking about individuals, right? Peoples, where the labor forces, there's a lot that's leaving our continent in raw form, right? That's then being processed or manufactured, etc., right? And then that we then buy back, and there's a lack of understanding of where exactly within that chain we fall, and the influence that we can have to determine, right, that chain. And I think we don't get that yet, right? And so often when we come to the bargaining table, we tend to come there thinking we're on the back foot, when I don't think we realize that there's actually so much that we have, that we bring to the table, that I think, if we fully grasped, could completely change the power dynamics of the world, right? Of sort of the global economy. So yeah, that's what I think about. And maybe just specific to the work that I do, we talk about tax justice, right? We talk about it being important that African countries are sort of harnessing their own resources in order to fit their own developmental objectives, right? And one of the ways that's important, one of the things that's important when trying to do that, is address the loss of resources, right? That's coming out from a country at any given time, illicit financial flows.
Mm.
If we're to put an actual on the amount of money that as a continent we are losing, it's actually much more than what comes into the continent, right? In terms of assistance as well as debt, right?
Sure.
We don't know that, right? And I feel like if we knew that, we would view ourselves very differently, because in a sense, then Africa is a net creditor, right? To the economy. I guess to my point, right? So I think if that switch, that light bulb, sort of went on, I think in the psyches of all of us, I think there would be a very different way. We would view ourselves very differently, and come to the table in a very different way.
That's fascinating. There's a terrible kind of an artificial imbalance, isn't there, in the way things are set up. So as you say, it kind of, and the portrayal of that is the developed countries kind of giving things to the developing countries, but as you're showing, it's often the other way around.
And I think maybe just as you're speaking, something else came to mind. I think, I don't know how much I can see on this podcast now, but I think there's also an intentionality around having that mindset be what it exists. And when I say this, I think you may have seen it, right? The number of times I've seen, at least on my social media feeds, right, that the accurate map of the world, right, vis-a-vis the map of the world that we use. And it's interesting to me, because the current map that we use that shows the size of continents and countries is inaccurate. And there was an effort to actually try and correct for that, right? And that was shut down, which is crazy, right? You would think that it would be in everybody's interest for us to have the most accurate maps, right? That we use. But part of the reason behind that is because, with the most accurate map of the world, you'll see that the United States, that China, etc., all fit within the continent of Africa, right? If we knew that,
Yeah,
I think
it changes things.
changes things. And there's something about you understanding, again, that point I made about the power that you actually hold. So I think it's actually quite intentional, this idea of Africa being portrayed in a certain size vis-a-vis everybody else's, that yeah, that needs to be part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, I absolutely remember that. I think it was called the Peter projection, or Peter's projection is probably why I remember it.
Yes,
And
exactly.
as you say, that it's
The
kind of
word
disappeared. I had a
yeah.
copy years and years ago. I don't know what ever happened to it, but it's really interesting, as you say, because then the way the conversation about power is set up, or the way it's framed, and that's a really good example. And that's also then true to the way the conversation is about who's got the power. So is it the developed
Mhm.
countries or the developing countries? So there's a kind of framing, isn't there? I'm
Mhm.
curious to know if you have any thoughts about how that framing can be disrupted and changed then. I mean, what could you do? I mean, I know it sounds like you're educating, but are there other things you can do, or how do you approach that? Changing the framing, the narrative, really.
I think it starts with ourselves. I think we can't convince anybody else about our own power unless we're aware of it, right? And so that looks like, for example, changing education curriculums. The reason this is interesting for me is because I remember when I started university, I wanted to take literature. And I remember specifically I wanted to take African literature, and they said to me, "Oh, well, you can only take that in third year." And I remember saying to myself, why would I need to take African literature in third year? They said, well, it's an elective, right? It's a special course. And I said,
Mhm.
okay, but Shakespeare in my first year, that's considered mainstream, right? Here in Africa, whereas, Chinua Achebe is, somebody that I want to read, it will only come in third year, right? It spoke to just the upside down way in which we are learning about ourselves, right? And the way our education system is structured. And that has implications, right, on in everything else. So I think the first thing that we need to do is, I think, change what we are teaching ourselves,
Mm.
change what we are teaching our children, so to speak, understand, like I said, the power that we have, and only then, right, can that then be communicated fully to outsiders.
That's fantastic. Lovely, lovely stuff. I'm really aware of your time because I know you've got to zoom off to something else. Um, but I wanted to just end really then by giving you a chance to say anything else you wanted to say about power in any of these domains. So, been a great conversation. Thank you so much. But in terms of policy or in your own organization or indeed in this broader framing, anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is what I just landed with now, right? I think it's really important to recognize the power that lies within, right? So I think we were talking earlier, right? I think as a continent, as a region, what we bring to the table is so much more than I think we give ourselves credit for, right? I think that's first and foremost. I think at an individual level as well, I think it's really important to recognize that power manifests very differently, right? And although it may not manifest itself in sort of what's considered mainstream, doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have it. But also, there's different times, right, to use different types of power. It's effective in different ways, right? And to sort of play around with exploring, what is most meaningful or impactful at a given time. So I think for me, the conversation about power is so nuanced, so dynamic, and it's important to explore what that could mean for each of us at an individual level.
So it sounds like if I was to ask you about a practice, it sounds like you'd argue for kind of some kind of reflective internal practice as well, thinking about this, talking about this as a
Absolutely.
first step. All right, lovely. Okay, well, thank you so much, Chenai. That's really lovely. Been great to talk to you. Uh, I wondered if it might be possible to get you back maybe in a year's time when you're further along this route and see how things have developed. Would you be up for that?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great.
That would be smashing. Thank you so much. For everybody else listening, we will release some other episodes soon. So watch this space on your favorite podcasting platform. And again, thank you, Chennai. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pete.